This is Visions Under Construction, a chance for our guests to share their visions and tell us what they're working on. For their continued support, we'd like to thank Simwood.com, who can turn you as a developer into a telco. Why not make CloudOnyx your communication partner? Go to cloudonyx.io. You can find everything about the VUC at vuc.me, thanks to Bluehost, and thanks also to zipdx.com, the conference bridge, and to voxphone.com for local rate dial-ins. And we're really pleased today to have Dr. Paul Vixie, the internet pioneer, with us. I'm sure he's sick of hearing that, but I just wanted to mention one thing before we get to Paul, which is Camellia World, where several of us are going to be meeting. That's 14th to 16th May in Berlin. Boy, it'd be terrific to have you, Paul, but I don't think you've got that on your schedule. Here, we're going to switch our camera. I talk to myself when I'm doing this part, okay? There we go. All right, Paul Vixie. Hey, Paul.
Hey.
Yeah, very pleased to have you. If you don't mind, we've already interrogated you on your background and how you got into the digital DEC stuff and all of that, so we don't need to go there. We know a little bit about your background. Of course, if anybody doesn't know that name, Google it immediately so you know who Paul is. He's an amazing person. And he's going to talk about all kinds of things, including his fail fast and fail often, or is it the opposite? But Paul, we got on a little roll here talking with Michael about this leaked PowerPoint presentation about how someone was suggesting, someone from the government, I think, was suggesting that the government manage 5G internet access, and that would include fixed access, apparently, by radio. And what I was saying is that the United States, who invented the internet, and you were there, basically, has no competition or not sufficient competition. And I was saying with Keith, who's in the United Kingdom, and Andy and Corrado also, that in this area, it's usually been the post office, ironically, who started all those investments. So the infrastructure is there. And now most countries, at least UK and France, those countries, the infrastructure is forcibly shared with almost anyone who has a minimal investment to put in. So what we have is we've got three main carriers for cell phone service, but we have, you know, anyone can come in and do an MVNO and offer the service at similar prices. And as far as internet goes, just as an example, we are currently paying under $50 for a gigabit fiber connection. And in the United States, I think you're paying that for eight megs up. I don't know. Paul, what do you think about, first of all, the idea that the government controls 5G, which I think is a little silly, but maybe that they should be making paying for the infrastructure and then forcing it to be shared?
Well, of course, there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. We have something somewhat similar to that with regard to telephone pole access and right-of-way. So, you know, if you pay the money, if you're the first carrier in and you paid money to string telephone poles through some neighborhood, you can be compelled to rent access to those poles to your competitors at mandated rates. That has been huge for competition. You know, the debate we've been having for the last year or so, actually longer, but it's gotten loud in the last year about network neutrality, is really about network competition. If we had vibrant last mile competition, then network neutrality would not be an issue, because any provider who chose to, I don't know, slow down some traffic and not others would have to charge a lot less, because otherwise they'd lose business to a competitor. And it is because we lack competition that this whole thing about network neutrality even remains an issue. So at the moment, our politics in the US is very much driven by a false dichotomy of either the government is in charge or the corporations are in charge. And you know, we've done some good work over the centuries, both in this country and elsewhere, by saying that the various collectives that humans can make, be they corporations or other businesses, churches, political parties, governments, those collectives all have a role, and we have to balance their powers. We can't say that it's all one or all the other. But at the moment, we have that false dichotomy going on. So we don't get to really argue about what you just said here. Now, I do want to raise a specific example. There are some metropolitan areas, in other words, a city surrounded by smaller cities that all is served by one or two airports, who have set up a joint powers system for access to the last mile. And in those cities, the citizens have the best connectivity for the cheapest prices. And the reason is that you don't have three different companies all having to dig up the streets. You have the first one in is forced to share, or maybe the government puts it in. But one way or another, the competition is at the edge of the city. So it's a little bit like how we buy our electric power. You can choose to pay more for your power and get it from a producer of power that is using, say, hydroelectric. That doesn't mean that hydroelectric producer had to build a power line all the way to your house. That means that we've come up with a sensible system in the middle where we facilitate competition and we facilitate innovation. And again, that is that violates the false dichotomy. We're supposed to have to choose between innovation or competition, and turns out that's not true. But in this day, in this age, we're not really going to be able to have that discussion in the United States of America. We need this Tea Party phenomenon to flare out and go the way of the dodo bird, and then we can go back to having reasonable discussions about adult things.
Even before the Tea Party, though, we've had problems in the U.S. of as you say, the municipal networks things has been quite successful, with notable examples to the contrary. But they've gone, the incumbents have gone so far as to lobby for legislation to make it illegal to fire up municipal networks in many jurisdictions, and that even predates the current sort of Tea Party Freedom Caucus movement. Let's get a clarification out there, Paul, though. The situation that Randy describes of incumbent infrastructure being shared, did we not have that up until about 96 when things were reworked? Because I used to get my DSL service, slow as it was, from what did they call them? A CLEC, a competitive local exchange carrier, because I preferred not to do business with AT&T or Southwestern Bell, and so I got it from Covad. But those guys, they kind of went away in a regulatory move in the late 90s, or at least that was my impression.
So I don't think so. We still have CLECs, and they do not own the copper to my house. So I think that at that level, we do still have some competition. What we don't have is investment, right? There's nobody out there who has deep enough pockets to say, let's get all of these houses on one big municipal fiber network, and then we will all profit from it. Nobody who has the money also has that vision.
The impression I had sort of from the outside, having owned a property in Florida for a period around there, was that there was a fair amount of investment in terms of cable TV network infrastructure being put in around that sort of time. But what actually happened is a lot of those companies got absorbed into the Time Warners and so on. So they still exist, but as part of those large companies.
I think Keith mentions. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul. Well, I was just going to say, Keith is bringing up an interesting problem in the U.S. It's kind of specific, which is that as soon as you have cable, we've rented vacation places. They've got cable, and then their internet comes through the cable. So then there's another thing, which is the stunting of the growth of certain kinds of internet entertainment because it's in competition with the cable provider themselves. That's a pretty big problem in the States, especially. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, what I wanted to say is that these smaller companies that build out some infrastructure and then get absorbed are, they're rational actors. They are building something that they hope to profit from, and then if somebody wants to buy it, in exchange for some share of future profits, then that's the best thing to do with your investment. It is sad that that leads us to a whole lot of very short-term expedient choices. I just want to point out that in South Korea or Japan, they've got vibrant competition. The telcos make a great deal of money, but their services are better than ours in the U.S., better than anywhere in the U.S., and cheaper. So again, this comes back to the same false dichotomy. Do you want the corporations to be in charge, or do you want the government to be in charge? And my answer is a little bit of both, please.
And this problem really speaks to the actual interest in humanity, or at least in the society of the country we're talking about. Whereas, do you want good internet access? I think that there's a big division between people in power often who just think that internet access is us chatting, or what we're doing now, which is legitimate, but it's not a big deal, or actually kids learning how, on so many different topics. I mean, or just
people
as
finding jobs,
education, information that you could never get ever before. I have a problem with an electric radiator. I went on a forum. Those things still exist. A little private forum, bunch of people who know everything about radiators you could ever imagine. And I asked a question. Within a day, I had the total answer. You couldn't make enough phone calls to get that information. So the internet is a fabulous thing. Health information. There's just so much future importance in this. It's probably, the guy from Google, the CEO, said that AI will be more significant than electricity, which I don't believe, by the way. But I think that the internet is certainly far more significant in the advancement of the entire human race than electricity. Well, that's a little silly, but you see what I mean. It's huge impact, huge importance for the future. So we need to have that as a utility, I think.
Yeah, but there's a aphorism that no pebble feels itself to be part of the avalanche, and we need to see ourselves as a body politic first. Certainly, you could not have the internet without electricity. There's a lot of things you could not have without electricity. So it may be the right thing to look at as a fundamental enabler. But I will say that in terms of just the community that you can build when people can talk, can reach out, can publish, can index, can reach, it's a huge off-books value. And we're not paying attention to that because it doesn't have a dollar figure associated with it.
Right. I want to ask you something. I don't want to detract. If you had a presentation that you particularly wanted to give, we should get to that. But I did want to ask you how you felt as someone who basically helped build this whole concept, how you saw it. What is your vision? I mean, after all, we are now visions under construction, the VUC. What is your vision? What's your vision for the immediate future or the far-reaching future? Do you have one? I'm sure you do.
Well, I've had many. I probably have one right now. First, let me put myself in context. When Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf wrote the idea of the network of networks on the back of a cocktail napkin, I was 6 years old. So I was not there. They did not ask my advice. I had no idea what was going on. Later on, when the internet really started getting going was because of BSD, the Berkeley System Distribution of Unix, that was funded by the US government because they needed something to use that wasn't an expensive mainframe. And so this seemed like the right place for them to cut in, and boy, were they ever right. But when that came out, I was, I don't know, maybe 20. And I remember the first time I got to meet the BSD people, like Eric Allman, for example, or Kirk McCusick. And they were just towering figures at the time that I was just coming into this. So I really want to place myself in context. I am a latecomer. The fact that I've been doing this longer than most people does not mean that I was early. This thing is older than I am. Now, as to the vision, as you know, I was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in, I don't know, 2012, I think, 2013. And what I said in my acceptance speech is that I had spent the first half of my career trying to make internet connectivity happen, trying to make it possible for people to communicate. And yes, I wrote some of the software and some of the protocols that made that happen, late though I was. And then I spent the second half of my career trying to prevent bad connectivity, unwanted connectivity. In other words, to prevent abuse. I started the first anti-spam company and got sued out of existence for my troubles. Anyway, the vision obviously changed in between the first half and the second half. I thought, as I think a lot of people did, that if you make every man a publisher, then you're going to get sort of more publication. You're going to get more value, more content, more information available to more people. It turns out that that is naive, because if you make it possible for every man to be a publisher, a lot of them are going to be spammers. And if you make it possible, let's say, to do e-commerce without having to sort of go down to the store and pull out your wallet, and you make it possible to buy and sell things online, a lot of those things are going to be illegal, or drugs, or the mechanisms that we use for online banking, online commerce, will then turn into sieves through which our money will leak. I've often been concerned that when I was a kid, pretty much in 1969, when the cocktail napkin was getting drawn, it would happen in San Francisco every month or two that some senior citizen would get mugged on their way back from the bank on Social Security Day. And that was a terrible thing, and I didn't like it, and I didn't know much about it, but, you know, the word would get around. Now, that senior citizen is at far greater risk, because they can be digitally mugged over the internet without actually harming them physically, but taking their money just the same by anyone in the world. You no longer have to put your body at the scene of a crime in order to commit one, and there's more crime than ever of that kind. So those of us who had some small part in building the internet should feel bad about the lack of safety that came along with our naive invention. And you can certainly look at the way that various elections have been, election outcomes have been swayed. I know that there is some debate still by some people as to whether Russia had an impact on the 2016 presidential election in the United States, but there is no debate that it has been affecting the elections in Ukraine and other countries surrounding itself for a long time. And that is all done with Facebook, and it's all done because we made every man a publisher, and now we have too much information for anybody to be able to really qualify any of it or filter it or understand, you know, this is bullshit, that's not bullshit. So at scale, I think humanity was not ready for this invention. So my vision is that we're going to have to move toward a little bit less digital freedom. As much as I despise the Apple Store and the idea that a company somewhere would choose what app I can run on my smartphone and which one I can't run, I have to say that something like that is our future. The idea that we just had another Flash vulnerability. Flash is a program that is published by Adobe. We just had another 0-day published yesterday. And, you know, my question is, why does anybody still have that on their computer? And my second question is, why did any of us still have a computer that is able to just run any software we pick up over the internet, right? Software is dangerous. Networks are dangerous. If you combine them, what do you think you're going to get, right? So we're going to have to tamp some of this down. It's going to have to be more difficult to make your own choices, because we don't have the information we need to make those choices. And I really hate saying that, because that was not the vision early on. So my vision going forward is that we're going to have fewer choices.
So there's going to be a little bit of restriction, and I totally understand what you're saying and agree with it. Unfortunately, then the discussion becomes who decides, and that's a whole other issue. Interestingly, I just received a phishing email that said that, well, your Netscape card can't be charged. We had a problem with this, so click this link and get, go to billing. And what's funny is, and this is how this stuff works, I did just change cards because because actually the card was somehow compromised and there were charges on it and we had to close it. So I actually did something that I almost never do, which is I clicked on that link. And then when I saw it was a .ru, I thought, well, I'm not on Netflix in Russia. I fortunately have, I think, enough ad blocking or script blocking software that nothing serious happened. And I didn't click further links. But my point is that even if you know what you're doing, basically, you can still get caught. And your example of Social Security people being mugged, I mean, that's happening every day on the internet. And we've all gotten all these emails of course, if you examine the grammar, and I did on this one, it was bogus. In fact, it was obviously someone who was not an English speaker. But who reads emails these days, right? You get an email and hey, we can't charge your account. Well, it happens that that I do have Netflix. I've gotten a bunch of Cities or Citibank stuff. I'm not at Citibank. So I go, yeah, well, that's obviously phishing. Click. But for the people who are on Citibank, they may well have clicked on that link. So yeah, somebody has to do something. Your comment on the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, they do what they can because it's not really in their interest to have this kind of malware out there. But there's been recent talk of all kinds of ads that were served on all kinds of sites that are malware. So that is a problem. Anybody have any comments? Because I just noticed that I've been talking for too long.
Well, I mean, I just think it's fascinating the difference in view, and it's often the same people, ironically, that you get people complaining about Google, for example, controlling too much of the Android ecosystem, but then on the other hand, they then complain about fragmentation and they complain about security issues. And it's like, well, you know, it's difficult to kind of be everything. You've some of these things actually you can't have both.
Well, if you get complaints from both sides, you're probably doing the right thing.
You know, your audio is a little weak, Corrado. Can
Sorry.
you repeat?
I mean, if you have complaints on both sides, you're doing too much or doing too little, you're probably on the right track.
That's true. I want to make a broader observation, which is that all of these, every one of these systems, whether it's an economy or an ecology, it's in some kind of equilibrium. In other words, if you start to think in terms of this phishing email that you were just talking about, the reason that's being sent is that it works. If after all these years nobody was clicking on that and nobody was losing money because of it, then there would be no reason to keep sending it. And that's true of spam in general. If nobody bought anything that had been advertised to them by spam, then the rest of us would not have to get spam. But there is some core audience for this. So in most ecosystems, what you'll say about the equilibrium is that a certain type of activity, certain type of life form will continue to grow until it runs out of food or until something else comes along that wants to eat it. And if you don't have that, if you don't have an equilibrium, if you have an open loop control system in that sense, then you're going to see things just get worse and worse and worse until there's a catastrophe. And I'm afraid we're on the second course here because nothing eats spam. If we could get, let's say, everyone who receives a spam that claims to be from their bank or claims to be from Citibank, if they're not a customer, if we could get them all to report all of that stuff to one of the nonprofit sort of collectors like bank, then I think we would be able to put some back pressure on that. We would be able to find something that, in other words, that eats the thing that is choking our ecosystem. But right now we don't have that. People solve the problems they have.
Well, for those of us who have run, I do not do this anymore because it's way too much work, but life is too short for this. But if you're running your own email server, of course, you can use you can use all the blocking lists, which use DNS. I don't know if that was part of your work in DNS, but they do use that. And maybe I don't know what spam operation did you conceive of, by the way? Your company was what?
We started a nonprofit anti-spam company called MAPS, MAPS. It was the Mail Abuse Prevention System. It's also spam spelled backwards, so we thought we were very clever. And that would have been around 96 or so. So we invented the distributed reputation system called the RBL. And even if you're not running your own email server, which I still do, but even if you're not, it is safe to say that no email that you or anyone else ever receives from now until the end of time will not have been protected by at least one RBL lookup. So we feel somewhat responsible for that. I kind of wish I'd patented it. But the problem is the people who want to send you the spam are often going to send it from people you can't block. So, for example, I've been doing a little bit of spam reporting this morning while I waited for this call to start, and all of it came from Google except the stuff that had come from Hotmail. And guess what? I'm not going to block Google. I will not say, I'm sorry, Google, you're sending me too much spam. I'm not going to let you send me any more email at all until you clean up your act. They're big. I'm small. I can't afford to do that. And as long as the bad guys who want to send this stuff can continue to find places to send it from that I won't block, then that kind of blocking won't work. That's why, although we invented it, whatever it is, 20 years ago, 22 years ago, we're still getting spam. That was not a silver bullet, in other words.
Yeah, I used to use several, maybe 10, 12 RBLs, block lists, including Spam Cop and Spam. You also use Spam Assassin to run all that, and Spam Assassin. The thing I found, though, because this spam was even bigger then, I think, than it is now, in like the 2000s or so. And what I found was that I had to change the filters every day. Because first you start getting spams that just said hi. So I said, well, anybody who just says hi, I probably don't know them. I don't want to go into detail. I could go on and on. There were hours and hours and hours of modifying the filters and the behaviors. And what happened was that Google, for example, actually does a great job. Gmail does a terrific job at this. And the fact is that on my Gmail address that wasn't out there with tons and tons of web page links to email, gets almost no spam. I mean, I probably get one a day, more than maximum one a day, and a lot of false spam alerts from people who are borderline spam, but who aren't completely spam. Anyway, so that is not a problem so much for me. On my other account, though, that's also it's Google Apps or whatever they're called this week. That thing, because that domain had probably 25 different addresses published on web pages back in the day from the 90s, that thing gets 500 spams a month. But Google detects every single one. I've never seen a spam on that account. So your work is done, Paul.
Well, I wish that were so. I don't use Google for my email because I don't want them to be able to index it and associate all those trigrams with me and n-grams. But I also want to point out what I said before. People solve the problem they have. Google has very good spam filtering. And so if you are using a Gmail or using a hosted account, you'll see a lot of stuff fill up in your spam folder, but you will not actually have to read it. That's because Google cares very much about that. On the other hand, Google sends a great deal of spam. They allow those customers to transmit a huge amount of dreck. And that's because they don't care about that. That is not going to cost them any money, won't cost them any reputation. And so the fact that they are sending more spam than they are receiving does not mean that my job is done. It means that the problem has transformed from the one I thought I had to a different one, which is the human nature.
Are you still working?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have an observation from my memory that goes back a couple of years ago. I think there was a discussion about making people pay to send you emails, because most of the profit in spam is firing millions of emails that cost you nothing, and even if you get $1 out of that, it's all full profit. But if you need to pay something to get my address or to send something to me, probably is no longer profitable. Is that something that we could look at?
So that kind of micropayment system has been proposed many times, starting back in the mid-90s when we first commercialized and privatized the internet and more or less invited this problem in. I'm not going to go through a takedown on that idea here. What I want to say instead is that a friend of mine, Vernon Shriver, maintains a website which you can Google for. So look for the final solution to spam, FUSSP, final and ultimate solution to the spam problem, FUSSP, because that's in there. And he explains in a few pithy words exactly why that is not a solution to the problem. FUSSP, final and ultimate solution to the spam problem, which is a joke. There isn't one. So he's got a list that maintains the things that pretend to be that can't be. But I think the difficulty with email is that a lot of the people that I do want to hear from aren't going to pay. So that's just not a good filter. And asking them to make a small deposit that I will refund if I don't think that what they, sent me as spam is also a bit of a problem. So I guess also bad guys are able to spoof the payment system. This is all the outcome of an open system. This was thought of in 1969 when we were coming out of the Vietnam War. We were coming out of the hippie era, and the entire internet protocol suite, everything about it was designed to sort of leverage community and to depend on trust. And obviously, when you commercialize and privatize something like that, then it ends up with a different set of ethics than it was built for. So openness is what's hurting us.
And I would sort of argue also that email is becoming less important, but what we're experiencing now is spam in other cases like social networks, chat systems, and that's in some ways more difficult to detect and control.
Also telephony. I mean, we have to sort of lump robocalling and all of that into this too.
Yes, there's no system we can build that will not be abused by people who want to behave extractively.
I would maintain that the only system that works is actually having a brain and being skeptical about everything you see and hear that has any, as much as I love the internet, by the way, I just said a love story, but at the same time, you've got to be careful, even if this is coming from within your bubble. I mean, by now, everybody knows that they're in a bubble, right? So you're in your bubble of right, left, center, or whatever it is. People who like drones, people who think that the FAA should regulate drones, whatever your thing is, you're watching stuff that's in your bubble. But the point is that even within your bubble, stuff that you like, you should be this is my opinion, of course, you should be looking at it going, but really, is that true? And is that substantiated somewhere? And if you could start doing that, yes, you probably won't believe much that you read, but at the same time, you probably won't be harmed by it either. So I think that's one great way.
Could scale.
Well, it scales for one person, I guess, but yeah, it doesn't. This is a problem. This is having a brain and applying it to what you're looking at is a problem. And this speaks also, that problem speaks to reflexes that young people who grew up online. I mean, none of us here, looking at the faces here, none of us here were born with smartphones in our hands or tablets, okay? We probably didn't have them in high school or barely. In this day and age, of course, everybody does. And that's a whole other paradigm, actually. It's a problem that I don't know whether we should be worried about it or say, hey, that's their problem. I'm not sure.
I choose to worry.
Good for you. We need people like you, Paul. I want to ask you a quick, very simple question too, because we're talking about email. Email is ridiculously ancient as far as its technology goes. So one of the problems we have is, easy encryption, but also just the whole envelope, the SMTP, the entire paradigm of email is ridiculous because it's just uncontrollable. Do you see a solution there, like email changing, or is email so out of date that nobody's going to care now?
Well, so we have to be a little bit fair to the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, who has bolted on things to email. There's all sorts of changes to SMTP have come in the 3 decades of its use. All sorts of changes to the headers. We've got MIME. We've added SMIME for security. We've added a lot of stuff. And the anti-spam community has also added some things. We've got the ability to guess pretty reliably whether something was not sent by the person who claims to have sent it. And so we've added all sorts of tiny little features. We've made the whole thing just insanely complicated, and the bad guys have kept up with all of it. So it hasn't really made a big difference, except now I can get attachments with pictures of cats. So as far as something replacing it, a lot of things have been proposed, but it has so much inertia. There are so many systems that can speak SMTP that will never be upgraded. They're burned into ROM or whatever that is, like my printer is able to speak SMTP to tell me it's out of paper. I'm never going to adopt some replacement so completely that I refuse to accept email from my printer. And that creates what we call the long tail problem. So I think a truly new system that could replace email and was much, much more expensive to abuse would probably take 50 years to deploy. And none of us feels like that's a good use of 5 decades of our time. So there's just no incentive to do the only things that could be done to fix this problem. So instead, we're going to continue to bolt stuff onto it and live with the gradual decrease of.
Yeah, well, there's an absolutely huge inertia to email and send mail and stuff like that. So, yeah, I guess that's what's going to happen. And the new, in my peers, a lot of times the best way to talk is by email. And a lot of people chat with me over email, which I don't find the best way to go, but they do. And, yeah.
Let me answer your question a little bit differently. I mentioned that my team developed the first DNS-based reputation system called the RBL back in the mid-90s. That probably was a mistake. I will say that if we had not done that, then the problem would have grown much faster. And I think we might have seen a lot more radical public reaction to spam. I think we couldn't stop it, but we slowed it down enough that it became a gradual insertion instead of a sudden insertion in people's lives. So I actually have some regrets there. Nevertheless, I learned a few lessons and I've taken them to heart. And in 2011, Vernon Shriver and I came up with something called the RPZ. So it's not the RBL anymore, it's the RPZ, Response Policy Zone, which again is techno geek speak for something that most people don't need to understand, except that it doesn't help you publish reputation information about email senders, which the RBL does. Rather, it lets you publish reputation information about domain names and about the results of domain name lookups. This comes of my decades of experience maintaining bind and writing DNS-related RFCs. So I'm very hip to the fact that nothing can happen on the internet if DNS is not working. You can't do anything if DNS lookups aren't working for you, and no one is going to receive any communications from anyone unless DNS lookups are working for their names. So when I say nothing can work, I mean no good and no ill can occur if DNS is not working. So interrupting the flow of DNS is actually a much broader solution than interrupting the flow of SMTP or email. So this system, RPZ, has been out in bind since 2010 as a patch. It's now also available for some other non-bind systems. It's completely unencumbered. Again, we didn't patent anything. It costs nothing to be a publisher, or you don't have to license anything to be a consumer. And I believe that if this continues its current growth, which is slow but steady, we're eventually going to get to the point where if some ISP, let's say, likes to host those Citibank websites, like the one that was in your phishing spam that you got, if some ISP is really sloppy and they want that revenue and they're willing to take that revenue, and then somebody else like Spamhaus or some other distributed reputation provider decides to just say, any address record coming out of the DNS that would result in this ISP's addresses being reached is just forbidden. We're recommending that you not do that. We have enough uptake on that. We could start to make both the abuse itself and the enablement of the abuse more expensive. And as I think all war is economics. You fight until it is unprofitable to do so, or until you can't afford to. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we tried to do with the RBL, and we failed. So we came back, 15 years later with the RPZ. We're going to try again with a more sort of a broader aperture to our weapon. We're going to gun these people down by making their DNS a lot less reliable than the DNS of good actors. So there is some hope. And that's why I say I choose to worry. I am going to keep plinking away at this until I feel like the world is once again as safe as it was before the internet. And as you know, that is a lifelong objective.
That's fantastic. I want to remind people, Paul, that you actually did present on some slides in a presentation on RPZ last year, about a year ago. So if they just go to vuc.me and type in your name, they will see everything you've ever done, which is 2 or 3 things, including today. By the way, I hijacked your presentation completely, but there was a topic you wanted to speak on. We have about a quarter of an hour. If you have 15 minutes and you still want to do that, we should go either way, whatever you'd like to do.
Well, I would like to talk about the robustness principle, because
Please.
it is precisely wrong. So it's often ascribed to John Postel, but I believe he actually got this from somewhere else. And what it says simply is that when you're building an internet communications endpoint, so an application or a protocol or an implementation, that you ought to, and I quote, be liberal in what you accept and be conservative in what you generate. And this was called the robustness principle because in terms of closed loop control systems, you really want it to be that you make every effort to exchange the message. And so if somebody is not quite speaking the protocol the way that you'd like them to, but you are able to discern their intent, then according to the robustness principle, you ought to accept that and do what you can with it. And this, again, fit pretty well with an academic internet that did not have commercial users, did not have private users, because everybody at the other end of those connections was at risk of losing that connection if they abused it. And that is certainly not true now, hasn't been true since 1995. So what you get from the robustness principle is spammers or other people who are abusing the network, they're abusing the privilege of communicating with me, are finding loopholes that allow them to act in the way they want to act without any recourse against themselves, with maybe shifting all of the costs toward you. And then they're gone and they've got whatever small amount of money they were able to make from that, and you never know who they are. And what would be better than the robustness principle is its opposite, which is if the other end does not precisely obey the rules as you understand them, then deny them the ability to pass you any messages. Make them fix their end before they can communicate. Make it their problem. So in the absence of that, by proceeding along what I take to be the exact opposite wrong path for all these decades, We now have a lot of systems that don't speak the protocol properly, and they make it impossible for us to add things to protocols, because it turns out some signaling pattern that we would like to use to signal some new feature has already been used by mistake by somebody who had no idea that that had any meaning at all, and they were putting some random value there because nobody looked at it. So I want to finish with a very specific story about this that isn't about protocols, but it is nevertheless isolated and I think perfect example of this principle. It comes to me from David Boggs. David was one of my mentors and bosses back at Digital Equipment Corporation from 1988 or so. And he's actually more famous than that. He is one of the 4 names on the Ethernet patent. So he was the radio guy who figured out how to cut holes in coax cables so that you could put vampire taps on coax cable and then attach them to your interface card. So he was vital to that effort, although he told me at the time, I think he was a PhD intern at the time working at Xerox on that. Anyway, so he told me a story once, standing around in some mini computer room, a lot of big, tall things, bigger than refrigerators, that were quietly humming away, transmitting email and whatnot. And he said that the problem with Ethernet is that we built it too well. And I thought, now that is a provocative statement. What could you mean by that? And, so I said, how could that be? How could you build anything too well? Now, today's listener, certainly the people on this call have all taken out a pocket knife and cut a hole in a coax cable and connected one of these vampire taps. So we know that Ethernet started out as a 10 megabit private radio spectrum. And that's how it worked, and it was magic for its time. It gave you 10 megabits of connectivity without having to do point-to-point cables, and it wasn't FDDI, and it wasn't token ring, and it was wonderful. Now we're still using the same protocols today, but there are really not very many of those thick wire Ethernet cables left. For one thing, we're speaking at gigabit or 10 gig or 40 gig or 100 gig speeds. And for another, we're doing it over twisted pair, going through a whole bunch of switches that have a whole bunch of RJ48s on the front of them. So what we see as Ethernet today bears no physical resemblance at all to what Ethernet was. Nevertheless, it had to be created, and it had to be created the way it was created, or we would not have today's world. So we really have to look back to these guys and say, thank you, you did something huge. So anyway, he explained himself as follows. He said, it's a private radio spectrum inside of a 50 ohm coax with a couple of 50 ohm terminators on the end. And you're supposed to put your transceivers, you actually cut your holes and mount your transceivers on 2 meter boundaries. And indeed, after they had invented this, and Ethernet had really caught on, you could buy rolls of coax, thousands of feet of this thick yellow coax or orange, that would actually have a black line written on it in the factory, so that you didn't have to try to keep track of where the 2 meter boundaries were, which they certainly had to do early on before there was an industry. Anyway, you're supposed to put your vampire taps there because that is the widest part of the sine wave of the radio spectrum. That just had to do with the wavelength of 10 megahertz. And that would mean that you would always be receiving the best, clearest signal, and you would be transmitting something that everyone else would hear as the best, clearest signal. Okay, so if you poke your head up above a T-bar ceiling at any of the squat buildings along 101 where all of this was first being deployed, what you're going to see is that most of the walls that you see in your offices don't go all the way up, but some do. The ones that surround the bathrooms, the ones that surround the elevators, and so forth go all the way up because they are load-bearing. But otherwise, you've got a few pillars going above the T-bar, but pretty much it's a open space above the T-bar ceiling with all those ceiling tiles. And as long as what you want to do is just adding Ethernet taps in that area so that you can add what were called drop cables that came down from the ceiling and plugged into the back of a Sun workstation or something along those lines, everything was fine, because you could always find some black mark on the cable that was within drop cable distance of where you wanted to add a station. The difficulty came inside the computer rooms, whose walls usually went all the way up. Because what would happen is the cable would come through some wall from the T-bar area, make a turn, go out through some other wall, because whoever laid the cable figured, yeah, we need some stations in. Well, if you have a lot of computers, and they kept getting smaller, so we kept having more of them, you're going to need more than one tap. And so Boggs told the story about how if you don't have a black line of your own, there's already a station in the part of the cable that you can see from where you are, you can break the rules. You could just cut a hole somewhere else in that cable and add a vampire tap, even though it wasn't on the top of a waveform, it wasn't on a black mark. And it would work. Everything would work fine. And the next guy could do it, and the next guy could do it. And we have all seen, at least Boggs and I had each seen, and I expect you guys have also, situations where the minimum bend radius had been violated in order to stretch the cable enough that you could add another station inside the radius of two existing stations. And if you bend the cable too far, then the inside of it's not round anymore. It's not coaxial. It's twin axle or something else, and it'll end up having the wrong characteristics. Nevertheless, even if you do that, it continued to work. And then later on, some poor guy who was just called in, I'm an electrician, I'm here to add a station for the cube farm, and I got my ladder, I got my vampire tap, I got my pocket knife. He would poke his head up above the ceiling. He would do an absolutely perfect job. He would do the job that you would take a picture of to put in the encyclopedia to say how this was supposed to be done. And the moment he turned it on, the entire network would fail. Everything would die. And it was because everything that had been added before had sort of so upset the balance of this delicate radio spectrum that it could not actually tolerate more load in the place that it was supposed to take it. And then you would spend days tracing down, okay, what if I unplug this? Does that fix it? And eventually you would just give up and pull a whole new cable through. And so Boggs finished the story by simply saying, if we had been able to build it in a very fragile manner, so that the first person who did the first bad thing would cause the entire network to fail, then it would discourage that behavior. But what we did not discourage that behavior, and then human nature came in, and we ended up with a system that had a reputation for flakiness because we built it too well. And I really have taken that to heart. I have tried very hard in my distributed systems work to have it be that if you ask me the wrong question, I'm not going to give you an answer you can use, because you have to put the back pressure on as early as possible. Otherwise, the entire ecosystem is going to be populated by things who either don't know what the rules are or don't care. So that's my story.
That's a fascinating theory, because I think all of us have maybe experienced this. Someone asks you a technical question, but they're not a technical person. Hey, that's not a sin. But you're constantly having to interrogate them because they don't give you the information you need. So this is a similar problem, in fact, because as long as the person is not being precise with their problem, you can't solve it. So in your system and what you're talking about, if everything isn't exactly as it should be, if it still tries to do it, in other words, if somebody asks me a question, I go, yeah, well, you just have to do this. But I actually didn't know what they were trying to ask. I just said something, because we have to not fail, right? We have to do this. We have to deliver. So that I'm starting to see. I have never thought about this before. Thank you for the thought-provoking philosophy, because this never occurred to me before. I guess I'm too young. Who else has some questions or comments for Paul? Go ahead, Michael.
Why am I reminded at that? Forgive me, I live in Houston, and sometimes things revolve around rodeo. I am reminded of the signs that you see at the Midway that say you must be this high to ride this ride. In that, and I'll crisscross this and pick on my wife while I'm at it. My wife spent 20-something years in broadcast media, editing video, shooting video, doing all kinds of things that went from being physical processes to being electromechanical processes to being entirely computer-driven processes. And the tools of the trade got ever more complicated, but the tool wielder only got incrementally more sophisticated over time, and to the point where you get to the point where you really ought to be, I hate to say it, smarter, but you need to be open to a different kind of experience. You need to kind of deal differently with the machinery of the craft at some point. And there are certain people who just shouldn't be handed computers.
So I know exactly what you mean. And I think it's worse than what you said, because not just the systems we buy, but the systems we build are increasing in complexity all the time. We're constantly adding a new, I don't know, home appliance that fits on our Wi-Fi that creates a, gee, I didn't know my refrigerator could relay spam. Thank you for that education. And it's inevitable that once we have a working system, we're going to want more features. And in order to add more features, we're going to bolt on more complexity. And so we're going to push the complexity further and further until the complexity of the whole is some multiplication product of the complexity of the parts. And even though we understand all the parts, we no longer understand the whole. This is bad for us, and yet we have to do it. We are humans, and we are the time frame in which we think and operate does not permit rationality at scale. So I do want to say that all of us, not just your wife, but all of us, even those of us in a technical field, really need to go back to at least community college every couple of years and get ourselves a little bit further up to speed, because otherwise things will start to happen that will be so far beyond us that we won't even care. I myself am really ready to dismiss the idea of a self-driving car simply because I've written so many programmatic bugs that I now know that no car will be bug-free, and I don't want to get run over. On the other hand, we as a economy are being frog-marched toward self-driving cars because that will make a lot of money for various corporations who participate in that ecosystem. So it's inevitable, and I can't dismiss it, and I really need to study it, even though I'd rather not. And the same is true of machine learning, deep learning, AI, all of the newfangled stuff that I think I could just retire without learning that stuff. No, you can't. It's going to affect you whether you understand it or not. And that would be my advice to your wife. It's like, yeah, maybe some people shouldn't have computers, but chances are that she would be a vibrant source of intelligence about what to build next if she stays at the bleeding edge to the extent that she can.
And in fact, that more or less happened. But such people, people need support. They need resources to ensure that they can stay focused on the things where they have the attention span for it, because there's a lot of folks out there, when something's broken, they don't care that it's broken. They just want it fixed. And right. the minutiae of how you fix it is not of any interest at all. Just fix it. And so that was my role.
I understand. I've had that role. So I want to do a call out here, but first a short story. Diabetes is a big problem in developed society because we're eating so much refined food that we're taking in way more calories than we can burn, and that just ultimately starts to break things. That did not come about because we got smarter. It came about because most of us don't know anymore where our food comes from. The actual cause of the current diabetes epidemic is probably the food pyramid that was released in 1980 by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that put grains at the bottom and said that's what you should do the most. And we should all, to quote Randy from a while ago, be a little bit more skeptical about the things that were offered. Now, finally, I want to just do a shout out. The Girl Scouts of America have decided to take on cybersecurity. There are now a system of merit badges available to those young ladies, where if they learn certain things, they get a certain patch they can sew onto their coat or whatever it is, and it's working. They love it. They take to it like fish to water, and I believe there is hope for the next generation, because those young ladies are going to grow up to be, adult ladies, and they're going to start kicking ass, and they're going to start saying, I don't want that thermostat in my house. It's got bugs. And so I'm very, very proud of them for taking this on. This is going to be huge for all of us because they represent the future.
Couldn't agree more.
Thermostats or a doorbell, and you know something, is it?
Oh,
yes.
Boy. Don't get me started on the doorbell. Paul, just a quick comment on self-driving cars. Because if you drive, I haven't driven for a long time. I have to sometimes and rent a car, but I do not own a car. I haven't owned one for like 20 years because I live in a place where you can walk. But as you look around at other drivers, everything is possible out there. So I've come to I agree. I mean, I was where you are now. I go, do I really want that? And is that a good idea? And it scared me. And I thought there should be a lot of regulation, and not allowing those things on the street was a good thing. They did that in California for a while, and finally they approved it. My take, though, has become that we're such bad drivers that maybe the AI crap that they're developing is not worse. It's hard to say. I don't know. Maybe you need a mix of override. You're shaking your head, so I'll let you go right now.
Well, there's three things happening there that are not the frog march toward self-driving cars. I mean, it's inevitable we're going to have them. It doesn't matter what my opinion was. There's money to be made, so it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But first I want to talk about liability. In a traffic accident right now, it is possible by looking at the skid marks on the pavement to reconstruct exactly who did what to whom, and who had the last chance to avoid this, or who is, whatever. And you can figure out whose insurance company owes whom. If we end up with accidents involving self-driving cars, does that mean that the programmer is liable? Or is it the company who put the code into the car? Or is it the operator who clicked the really long agreement that you got to click before your Tesla will start up for you? Have you really taken on liability for all those bugs? We don't have a solution to that. And we're going to solve this by killing people and having lawsuits about it. And I don't like that. I wanted a different way to answer that question. The second thing has to do with killing people. You're right that humans are terrible drivers and they kill a lot of people. And it's even possible that self-driving cars will kill fewer people. However, we're going to kill fewer people in new ways. And I didn't agree to that. Right, I am being used as a laboratory subject without having signed a consent form, and that's a problem for me. And then finally, there's the end game, because the way that self-driving cars actually make a difference, let's say, to global warming or at global accident rates and all like that, is if they have exclusive access to some lanes of the road, because they can drive much closer to each other than humans could do. They don't need 10 miles or 10 feet of space for every 10 miles of speed or whatever. They can ride each other's bumpers, and it'll be safer than what we do today. My problem is...
Do you realize that you're just describing a train?
Yes, I am, except that it's a train without a track. These cars can can disconnect from each other without having to stop. So yes, it's a convoy effect, but that's just one of many. There are a lot of things that become safer if you take the humans out of the equation. So once there's a tipping point coming where most accidents will be from the small number of remaining human drivers, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to say, we got to get those people out of there. They're causing death and destruction. Okay, well, I have horses. I have some horse trailers. I have some trucks. I am not going to ask a computer to figure out how to get that horse trailer down my private road or in or out of a rodeo. I'm not going to expect anybody to help me park it. The responsibility for those horses is mine. I'm not going to wonder who is responsible for killing them by a programmatic bug or just hitting a situation you can't understand. I'm also a motorcyclist. I'm not looking forward to being told I cannot use the public road system anymore because I am the last remaining hazard. So you got to look at the end game. Before you take the first bite of that sandwich, you got to think about how the whole thing's going to feel in your stomach.
Those are excellent points, Paul. I wanted to mention that there was an episode of The Good Wife, which was an excellent to-the-minute TV series on, I think it was on CBS, that examined, somebody sued a programmer, and there was an issue of a hacker. I mean, you have to go back and find it. It's open on CBS, so it's not a difficult thing to find. And it was really interesting, and it was right when driverless cars were big in the headlines. You know, I find myself agreeing 100% with you, and yet I see the inevitable, maybe the writing on the wall, and hard to say, plus how many years are left. And, you know, there are a few advantages. I personally do not like to drive, but I've thought extensively, and I'm writing a novel, and in that is a particular moment where, because human drivers are still, this happens in the 2050s, human drivers are still allowed on the road, but they have to pay a huge amount of money, which means that only 1% can drive. And that's not necessarily a good thing either. So the point is, these are great things to reflect on. And I really appreciate that you've brought them to us. Sorry that we kind of curbed your talk, but I was very interested in hearing.
This has been great. Thanks for inviting me.
We really appreciate having you. I'm sorry that a couple of questions came in that were so specific. I don't think we have time to keep you for them. But Paul Vixie, thank you so much. We're honored to have you. Appreciate it.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time, and take care. I just want to mention that I'm working on some visions with a few other folks, and one of them is Abby Minisali. You know, that's Tony's daughter, who we've heard great things about. She'll be with us at the end of this month. Chris Matthew in a couple of weeks. Everybody knows compute.io. Chris is a favorite of ours too. And I'm also working on stuff that is not in computers. So Larry Taylor, who played at Woodstock with Canned Heat. You may remember that, Paul. You're old enough to get that. Played with Tom Waits. He played with John Mayall, and he and I have played together. And I'm interviewing Larry. We're already at the hour-and-a-half point, and we've barely started because he's played with everybody in the world. 75 years old. He started when he was 16, so do the math. Thanks, everybody. See you next week. And Paul will be back with us next year, if not this year, I hope.
You bet.
Thanks, Paul. See you next week, guys.